Man, don't you hate it when an evil god named Bios nearly destroys the earth? And you can't even go outside without flying lizard soldiers attacking you on your way to the store. There's like drones and robots everywhere just trying to murder you for existing. Trying to go to the store, grab a pack of smokes, and you get killed. And evil demigods are just hanging out all over the place, trolling everybody that passes by. It's just the worst. Or, well, it sounds like it would be pretty bad, and that's exactly what happened in Capcom's 1988 arcade shooter Forgotten Worlds. It was ported to several home computers and consoles, including the Sega Master System, but that version was only released in Europe and Brazil. So I never played the 8-bit game on Sega's surprisingly capable little console, even though I owned one. I did, however, love the arcade and Genesis versions, but once I found out about the Master System game, I had to give it a go. Forgotten Worlds, just like the ports of Ghouls and Ghosts and Strider, were actually developed by Sega for their consoles, instead of Capcom, who obviously created the game. The Genesis ports were about as close as home versions could come, given the tech, but the Master System versions were all impressive in the fact that they even exist and work on such weaker hardware. A lot of NES arcade ports would actually be completely different games. And while most versions of Forgotten Worlds are 2-player, the Master System version is only 1-player. And honestly, considering the fact that a reasonably faithful port exists at all for an 8-bit machine, I think that's understandable. In the arcade, you used a dial to rotate your fire in 360 degrees as you fly around, fight enemies, and collect zenny and buy upgrades from the shop before you eventually face a boss. It's pretty standard stuff. But the home versions had to contend with the fact that you didn't have a dial, and instead opted to rotate the gun by pressing 2 different directional buttons. We didn't have all those fancy dual analog controllers back then. In the Master System version, you automatically fire your gun, which is fine because even when you do have a dedicated fire button in the other versions, you basically have to shoot 99% of the time anyway. So it works surprisingly well in that regard, considering you only have a D-pad and 2 buttons. And even though the world is a devastated hellscape, apparently convenience stores still exist. But instead of soft drinks and road snacks, they're stocked with weapons and armor, which seems appropriate given the circumstances. It's one of the best aspects of the game actually, where you can buy a ton of different weapons like lasers, flamethrowers, homing missiles, guns that shoot behind you and all around you. You can also buy armor, life, and upgrades to your weapon power and movement speed. And you'll need that last one because you move rather slow by default. It's handled really well because you'll only end up using a small fraction of guns on any given run, and it adds a good replayability to the game. And you'll be replaying it a lot because, for some stupid reason that I cannot fathom, you only have 1 life and no continues. None. Zilch. Nada. You die? Then get good, stupid noob, because you're going back to the beginning. And you probably will die because enemies come at you from all sides, and they are rather fast, and in some cases will spawn right on top of you. It's not uncommon to be focusing on the bad guys coming at you from one direction, only to be gobsmacked by a group of mobs from behind you. It's pretty frantic, but the spawns are always the same, so the more you play, the better you should get. That's still no excuse for not having any continues. In the arcade, you can just put in another quarter and keep going. Why on earth would you take away that ability for the home version? I know they don't want you to keep just powering through it and be done with the game immediately, but still. Plenty of other games handled this problem by allowing the player at least a small handful of limited continues. Not having that here is one of my major complaints, because most of the enemies and bosses are reasonable enough to figure out, and if you manage your money at the shop correctly, you'll make it through. You can even buy a very limited item that does allow you to come back to life once you die. But the final boss is one of the cheapest pieces of bullet spongy crap I've seen in a long while. No matter where you are, he sends a couple of big projectiles or a cluster of lasers at you. They're random in nature, and they're twice as fast as you. I tried about every kind of flight pattern I could think of to avoid them, and it seemed to come down to luck more than anything else. And that's my other major complaint. Captain A-Hole, the final boss. Otherwise, it's a great port for a Master System game. It feels like the arcade game, as much as it can given the limitations, and like most Capcom games, it's a fun time. The music is good enough, except for this one boss tune that sounds like a bunch of headache-inducing bleeps and blurps. The shop and the huge variety of weapons are a lot of fun to test out on the huge variety of enemies. There are plenty of better versions of Forgotten Worlds to play, but if you enjoy playing or collecting Master System games, then I can give it the recommendation. Or maybe if you just enjoy seeing ports that technically shouldn't exist on inferior hardware but manage to turn out good despite that. But be warned again, that final boss sucks. Final score? 7.5. Pros: reasonably faithful arcade port. Tons of guns and upgrades. Plays good considering the hardware. Cons: one life with no continues. No two-player option. Captain A-Hole, the final boss.